We're very lucky then to hear from Namrata Shrestha, who is from the Toronto Region Conservation Authority, as well as an adjunct professor at the School of Environment at the U of T. Namrata holds a PhD in geography from the University of Toronto, with expertise in landscape ecology and conservation planning. Namrata has led and contributed to various initiatives that advance TRCA's ecosystem management objectives, mainly through strategic prioritization of conservation efforts to maximize ecological benefits at regional scale. This includes projects related to the implementation of terrestrial natural heritage strategy, integrated restoration planning, strategic invasive management, and road ecology studies. Most recently, her work has been to study and delineate regional and local landscape connectivity priorities for wildlife movement to facilitate strategic mitigation through transportation planning process. Namrata has been active in fostering research collaborations between academics and practitioners. She is involved in applied research at TRCA and the School of Environment to provide science-based guidance to ecosystem management policy, planning, and practice. I'm really excited to hear about sort of this transportation element when it comes to wildlife, so everyone please join me in welcoming Namrata.
I'm here to basically talk about road ecology work that I've been doing at TRCA and School of Environment, but I'm just going to back up a little bit and then talk a little bit broadly about urban biodiversity and its interrelationship with transportation planning. And while I'm at it, I want to start off with a little bit about background on why we are talking about cities, urban biodiversity. When we're talking about biodiversity, it almost feels like biodiversity is out there, nature is out there kind of perception. But more and more studies and the general perception has shifted, and we know that cities have been shaping and will continue to shape the future of the Earth, of the planet. And basically, more recent studies, UN, World Bank, they have reported that more and more people are living in cities now. More than half are in cities. 3.5 billion is the estimated population. It's expected to grow to 7 billion by 2030. An interesting part is most of these cities are not even built. It is estimated that 60% of these cities are going to be built around moderate, medium-sized cities in the next few decades. So it is very critical for us to think of how we are going to build these cities so that it's not just beneficial to human population for us, for our well-being, but also how we can integrate all of the other species needs. Because we know that we've been talking about this, that how all of these need to be integrated to have a healthy planet for us, well-being of humans itself rather than just the species in isolation. And so the sustainable cities are the buzzword now. We talk about sustainable cities all the time, and it's a necessity for human well-being. That's established as well. But building sustainable cities is not a trivial task. It requires complex understanding of social systems, ecological systems, and cuts across domains and disciplines, and we need to really get this complicated matter at hand to build sustainable cities. So when we talk about sustainability, of course, we're going to talk about the three pillars: environment, economy, and quality of life. So obviously, most of the human well-being, the higher quality of life, economy are well taken care of at various levels. Environment is also taken well care of, but again, some aspects of environment is less talked about than the other. So this is a slide that I like to show. This is from Stockholm Resilience Center, which basically, and this is from the seminal paper of Rockstrom et al. 2009. What this group did was they identified, or they outlined these 9 planetary components. And in their paper, they outlined that all of these components are essential for a healthy planet in the future. And they need to operate within this green space. They call it safe operating space. And their assessments of extensive study have shown that some of these components are already above, they are beyond the threshold of safe operating space. And beyond nitrogen and climate change, biodiversity is one of that component that is critically under threat. So biodiversity loss is basically something that we need to really take seriously. And why do we need to take it seriously? We can say that it is for the sake of biodiversity and it's the right thing to do, or we can also argue that biodiversity has been shown to provide all of these ecosystem services that we talked a little bit about yesterday, such as providing food, cycling nutrients, forming soil, giving aesthetic, spiritual opportunities, climate regulation, and so on and so forth. So all of these ecosystem services are provided by biodiversity. Some of them are well understood, some of them are not. And all of these are linked to our well-being, human well-being. So it's our own, for our own sake, that we need to think of biodiversity. So now, when we are talking about biodiversity, then we can talk about species. It's one way to think of biodiversity, but then there are other levels of organization. We can talk about genetic biodiversity, we can talk about communities, populations, and so on. We can talk about animals, birds, and we can also talk about plants, both in nature, natural wild areas, and in our backyards, as well as our patios and whatnot. So all of these combined make the biodiversity that is going to help us achieve our well-being, let's say. And these biodiversity and ecosystems are important for us. And we know, we have discussed this multiple times in this workshop and in other conversations, that these ecosystems and biodiversity are threatened from various sources, not just anthropogenic, they're natural sources as well, and so on. But while we are talking about anthropogenic disturbances, these linear infrastructure such as roads, and we can talk about pipelines, we can talk about railroads, power lines, all of that, but for now we're going to stick to roads. These roads, they basically, what they do is that they fragment this otherwise intact landscape. Say there's no urbanization, there is no other direct disturbance, but just passing of roads from certain landscape divides the otherwise intact landscape. What it does for animals, in addition to other impacts, just for animals, what it does is it fragments the landscape. So it disrupts the processes that's going on in it for animals, such as it creates barriers for wildlife movement, so the animals can't get to the places, the resources that they need to thrive in the landscape. And they also result in direct road mortality. Some of the others are going to talk about road mortality today. So these combines, the cumulative effects of these impacts, basically over time, what it does is that it basically makes it harder and harder for organisms to survive in this landscape, and then ultimately it gets extirpated. So there has been various studies in terms of what that threshold is as well. So road ecology, which is what the rest of the talk is pretty much going to focus on, tries to understand these implications, the movement, the connectivity. This aspect is one of the components that road ecology tries to get at. So it tries to understand the implications and then come up with solutions. How can we make this better? And what this has done is, with help of planning and design community, what this has done is it has been able to achieve some of the mitigation and solutions. Like these, some of you probably have seen these big glamorous mega structures that tries to connect these large landscapes, such as in Banff. Some of these are from Netherlands, and so on. They try to connect these large landscapes through these mega structures, overpasses, and so on. Millions of dollars are spent on connecting these, mostly for large megafaunas. And these are often viewed as solutions to the road ecology problem, the connectivity problem. But what is hard is that to make a case for this kind of structure in urban areas where the habitat is this small and then critters are even smaller, so it's hard. So often road ecology is dismissed at a political level. So what we have been trying to do is trying to make a case that this is just as relevant, this thinking is just as relevant in urban areas. We don't have megafaunas, but we still do have different kinds of biodiversity. Some of them are common, some of them are not, they might be small, but just as important, and so on. And trying to make a case that road ecology solutions, the mitigation solutions, can range from anything from that mega structures to small specialized culverts, like this is specialized culvert for amphibians, or just the watercourse crossings, and some of the simple seasonal fencing, even closing the road while the critters are moving, putting up signs, just educating public, and so on and so forth. So all of these are relevant, and this is also this is where planning and design also have played very important part. And Marta is not here yet today, but her supervisor, Nina Marie Lister, and involved in ARC project and so on, they have done pretty good architectural designs on this aspect as well. So this is what we've been trying to do, is that while we are building these infrastructure, urban infrastructure roads, we can still incorporate needs of other organisms through these thinking. So I'm going to present a couple of examples from this region, Toronto and region, mostly included, led by TRC, Toronto Region Conservation Authority. For those who are not from this region, just showing that this is our jurisdiction, 9 watersheds, Mississauga, Brampton in the west, to Ajax, Pickering in the east. In north-south gradient, it's like urban core, downtown, to suburban areas, to greenbelt in the north. So we have a gradient of landscape in this jurisdiction, and we are somewhere here in Toronto. So anyhow, so this region, so we are working with a gradient of landscape, which means that we encounter different kinds of species, different kind of organisms. Biodiversity in Parkett in downtown Toronto is not the same as what we find in Oak Ridges Moraine up north. So all of that is considered. And the interesting thing about this region is that all of the municipalities, regional and local municipalities, they are very much keen on this biodiversity front. They want to keep the ecosystem healthy. They want a resilient ecosystem where species don't go extinct every minute, and so on. So there are various plans, programs, policies put in place. TRCA helps our municipalities to achieve all of this. So all of these are there. So the good intention is there. And we've also put together some of the tools, like this is what we call terrestrial natural heritage system. So for terrestrial ecosystem to thrive in this jurisdiction, we have outlined that these are the green spaces that if preserved, conserved, or restored, the species that we have here should be okay over next several decades. So again, there are a lot of assumptions there, but that's what we put together. And municipalities have bought into it. They have put it in their official plans and so on and so forth. But what we kind of lagged behind on a little bit is the overlay of road. So the direct and indirect impact of all, you can see it that well, but all the gray area, red lines that you see, that's the road in this jurisdiction. So we are thinking, when we overlay this net of road on top of this supposedly resilient ecosystem, are these ecosystems actually resilient? They might not, because we have various direct and indirect impacts. So all of millions of dollars that's going into restoring these land, is it actually achieving what it's intended to for the biodiversity? So that's where the discussion started, and what can we do about it? So the first work that we did in this road ecology aspect was that trying to deal with this issue was had some conversation with transportation managers at the region of Peel, which is on the west side of our jurisdiction. And we did a study for them, basically to give them tools to basically make informed decisions when they are planning their road projects, so that they can work towards protecting the connectivity issues and actually enhance connectivity for wildlife if possible. So we did, again, now all the sciencey stuff here, I'll try to breeze through this, that we then went to the core of the ecological principles in terms of who are we enhancing connectivity for, what processes, what kind of movements, and so on, and how do we mitigate it. So we basically went through the classic process of identifying which target group, wildlife group we are looking at. We identified that because we have a lot of wetlands and forests, and those amphibians and reptiles that use these habitat, mainly because they need to move between wetlands and forests. That's their life cycle. So roads were mostly critical for their survival, though those were the maximum impacted groups. So we focused on that group, and then we identified focal species that will represent most of the species within that group. And then we did extensive GIS analysis, ecological studies, to identify what kind of requirements they have so that we could map out their habitat. And then we also looked into, okay, so if we want to maintain connectivity for these organisms, what kind of movements do they do? Like, for example, if they're moving like 100 meters every day, versus if they're moving 1 kilometer every day, then we need to think of it differently. So we kind of looked at that level of difference in terms of what's the scale of their movement. And then we predicted potential strategic areas for mitigation. Strategic being the key here, because transportation managers, we ecologists, we basically like to be idealistic and say, well, try to do as best as you can everywhere all the time. But that doesn't work in the decision makers' world, because they have limited dollars to work with. So we need to give them, okay, here are the 10 spots, or here are the 20 spots, and so on. So it needs to be objective, and that's what we promised them that we're going to give them. And how do we mitigate? So giving them direction in terms of what are the design criteria and so on and so forth. So just a quick glimpses of the results. So these are all the wetlands that we identified through those studies in region of Peel that we identified as breeding habitat. There might be other wetlands, but we are saying these are the core habitat that we want to keep functional. So we identified that through GIS analysis. And then we identified the areas where all these wetlands were within 300 meters. That was sort of the general average distance that these organisms would be moving for their seasonal migration, for breeding and for hibernation. So all the shaded areas are the areas where forests and wetlands were within those 300 meters of each other. So that's, if the habitat is there, that's where the movement is going to be, right? So that's a simple sort of analogy. And then we created the habitat network, as we call it. That becomes the first filter. This is the key. This is the first filter in terms of where they can focus on instead of the entire jurisdiction all the time. And then we went on and did further GIS analysis that tried to get at, even within these habitat network, where are the areas where the organisms have to get to the wetland or to get to the forest, they have to pass the road all the time. So if 100% of the forest is across a road from a wetland, they will try to cross it. So that means that's 100% inaccessible, right? So we try to identify those. So based on the percentage inaccessibility, we again created a gradient of priority for all the road segments within the habitat network. So now if the Peel region takes care of all the high priority ones, then they can move on to the next level and so on and so forth. So we provided that information to them. And then this is the migration movement that we are talking about. So there could be one wetland, one forest, critters are there, they're going to move around, but that might be sink population. They might not survive there in 5 years anyways, but we still wanted to capture that, so we did this. But we also wanted to focus on long-term ability to adapt. So this is a complex ecological modeling process called circuit theoretic approach. I'm not going to bore you with that, but what it does, it tries to get all of those wetlands that I showed you before and tries to identify the areas that are contributing most to most of the wetlands. So that way, if there's a cluster of habitat in a good area close to each other, then that area becomes more likely to adapt, is more likely to be a better habitat so that critters can survive in that area longer, right? So we want to get that long-term ability as well into the picture. So that means it's basically just the connections between the high-quality areas. So we did that as well, and the overlay of these two became our strategic locations to communicate to the decision makers. So whether the long-term goals are met and short-term goals are met, both are met, that becomes our first hit, that becomes our first priority. And so we provided this map to the transportation managers. And the result was, obviously everyone likes colorful maps, so they liked the map, obviously, but more importantly, there were project managers in the room. And suddenly one of the project managers who was working on this road, the Gore Road, they said, okay, I'm doing something there, what can I do? They don't know anything about ecology, but they wanted to do something about it. So that is one example, and then there was another example, Heart Lake Road in Brampton, that I'm going to talk about a bit. So that is how we started sort of having this conversation with transportation managers. So in Gore Road, then because the project manager was interested, we basically said, okay, this is a broad brush stroke, let's do some detailed analysis for us to really guide you in detail. And then we went out, did field work, identified how many critters were getting squished on the road, and so on and so forth, all of that, and we identified the hotspots on exactly which culvert. There are like 11 or more culverts here in that stretch of road. Which culvert was which culvert could they retrofit more to accommodate this movement? And we identified a couple here and actually another one here. So now they're putting in some expanded culverts and so on and so forth, because now it was just like, easy thing to do among like millions dollars of their budget. What's like a few $1,000s culvert for them, right? So everyone wants to feel good about some of the good things they do. So that was one example. The other example, Heart Lake Road, this is a quite different story, because here we hadn't even completed the study, but some of their local residents, they were seeing all these critters squished on the road. They wanted to do something about it. They approached us. We sent our bios. We did the field work first. It was a sort of ad hoc process. And then when that was happening, this other project got finished, and we consolidated the two, and then we started having conversation about, here's the solution, here there's a justification that it fits into your big natural heritage resiliency program and so on, so we can do these things for it. So they were really, the politicians were on board, the engineers were on board, and we put some of the wildlife fencing, we are just doing some of the experimental work there as well. So that's another way to go about it, is the bottom-up approach. So that is sort of the road ecology side of things, the broader roads and just landscape in general. Now there's another story within TRC which was more connected to our policy. So TRC is involved in, so we have sort of a regulatory role when it comes to valley and stream crossings. So within valley, there's a regulatory role that TRC plays. And we have these guidelines that we develop to support policy. And obviously the valley and stream corridors, ravine, basically, TRC, Toronto in general, the GTA has this romanticized notion, like relationship with our ravines. So it wasn't a hard sell in terms of the expanded role that we could play in implementing these policies, which was mainly focused, these are our policies, that's what the policy is called, the Living City policies. The policy actually deals mostly with the hazard side of things, so preventing flooding, preventing erosion, and so on, so that the economic loss is minimal, the loss of life is minimal. And we also have this conservation role, but it's not regulatory, but still it's there. And we try to capitalize on this romanticized notion of Ravine City and then try to expand that, so that municipalities can voluntarily get involved in this planning process. So basically, these are all of the crossings, road crossing, those valley corridors, ravines in our jurisdiction. It's more than 3,000 now. It's increasing pretty much every day. So all these crossings, and these crossings, obviously, they facilitate or impede flow of water, as well as animals, small critters, and so on and so forth. We have small crossings like these. We have large crossings, viaducts, and so on like these, and so on and so forth. So basically what we did was to get at that conservation side of things. We basically said, okay, in the guideline, let us put some tools for you so that you can actually use the guideline to direct your decision making to accommodate these wildlife needs. So we basically said, we'll with two tools, and one we call planning tool, basically, for lack of a better word. So basically, it is to give in early stages of planning, when the decision makers are talking about big numbers and so on, in the official plan stage and so on. They still at that level, they know what to expect in terms of ecology. Often the complaint is that the ecologists basically come in the last minute when the shovel hits the ground and says that, oh, you need to do this, this, and this, and at that time their budget is set, their timelines are set, and they don't want to do anything. So that's the pushback. So we basically said, we're going to provide you with the tool at early stages of planning. And then also our hidden goal was to provide the system perspective. So it's not about that one crossing, but what that one crossing means in lieu of all of the other crossings. So that sort of outlines the trade-offs that we can live with and we can't live with. So we kind of took these two goals and tried to put a tool together. We went back to the natural heritage system strategy, which identified some of the high quality habitat and so on and so forth. Basically from all the green spaces, we identified, okay, here are the highest quality habitat that we believe will support all of these species. They're resilient, they will support the sensitive as well as common species, and they're most likely to succeed. And we want to keep connectivity among these patches. And then we went through extensive, again, the analysis, the modeling approach with this, and then the land use, the future land use. We even brought in all of the future land use that has been planned for the next 5 to 10 years, and then incorporated that into the sort of the resistance to movement of these organisms, what it means for organisms, how would organisms view those land uses, and sort of did that and came up with, again, the regional connectivity priorities, again, same as the Peel study, but here goals are slightly different, targets are slightly different. Came up with that. So you could have a habitat patch here, but on a grand scheme of things, this is relatively lower importance than other areas, like in the eastern side of Rouge watershed. So that way we could have a meaningful conversation in terms of trade-offs and so on and so forth. We are not viewed as unreasonable, idealistic deep ecologists. So that, and then we threw in the local connectivity piece. We threw in a bunch of other criteria for wetland species, for forest species. There are other things, other criteria as well that I'm not going to get into. And came up with, this is the valley depth, how deep the valley is. And then came up with the 3-color map. So Justin is smiling there because, so 3-color map, three colors are the maximum color that can be processed by most of the decision makers. I was told that. It's in the record, so I was told that. This is not me. Anyhow, so came up with these priority areas so that at the early stages of planning, decision makers know that if they hit red areas, there is going to be some issue there. So they better be careful and they better be prepared to have that discussion. So we did that for the entire jurisdiction, all 9 watersheds. And after we did this, and obviously this is sort of the planning tool, so it's high level, and we can't just leave it at that and say further research needs to be done. For practitioners, that's not an option. So we also have what we call design tool, which basically gets at, okay, once you zoom into that certain location, what do? You can't really use just the planning tool to do that. So we basically came up with all of the various criteria, flowcharts, tables, and so on, doing extensive literature search and so on, to provide some basic guidance in terms of if this, then that kind of situation. And so we provided opening sizes, the requirements for wildlife, and so on and so forth. So all of the details are also there in the guideline itself, so that there is no option of saying, well, we don't know what to do, so we are not going to do it. So some of them are already there. And then that helps us to basically, our planners, our plan review staff, the consultants and so on, and municipal project managers to say, okay, here's the situation and here's the decision flow. And so if it's this condition, then we are looking at large sort of over a bridge kind of situation. Without these bridges, the biodiversity is not going to be not going to survive in this certain landscape. Versus in other cases where well, there's still importance, but you can just have other design criteria like additional openings, small openings for amphibians and reptiles, some of the other considerations that are outlined, but you could still achieve your biodiversity goals. These are much cheaper than that. And then in other areas where there is nothing really, we can't really justify ecological criteria to ask for larger crossings, expensive crossings. Their water flow is alone dictates the crossing size. So we basically outline all of that in the guideline itself. And basically the long story short is what we are trying to do is eliminate these bad designs, which is bad for fish, for terrestrial organisms. It's bad to look at, and you know, all of that. It's bad for flow and all of that, to a better design. And while we are at it, we are also trying to accommodate the movement of organisms, not just flow of water and so on. So that, and so far what the initial discussion started, at least with me, in 2010, and within 5 years we have went from what road ecology to basically project managers coming and asking us what can we do. So we are there. There are a lot of business case has been made in municipalities, in other forums and so on. We have been able to translate this connectivity science in operational language, so people do understand. Engineers are not saying, why don't you just grab all the animals and put it up in the north? Like, no, we have gotten those response. Why don't you get all the deer and raccoons and put it up in the Oak Ridges Moraine? Those kind of reactions. Now we are beyond that. And the decision support tools, everyone is appreciating it. It will have its challenges as we implement this, but again, this is the first step that is being that has started to be implemented on the ground. And building partnerships, and this being one of that for me, is that between academics, between disciplines, among disciplines, like not just ecologists. I've been talking to architects, engineers, social scientists, and so on, and we've been having a real good, meaningful conversation in terms of building partnerships on this aspect. One thing that I would like to highlight is that various levels of success, we are successful, we are moving forward, but a lot of this is still, the comfort level is not that high up to be said this is operational yet. It is still a lot of the projects that I talked about, examples, are still in pilot stages. So call it pilot and no one has to commit to anything. So we want to go beyond that. So lastly, perfect timing, 2 minutes left, I'm early then, is that the goal basically for us, the big picture, is to basically bring in this whole connectivity piece as part of the larger landscape that values green infrastructure. So when we talk about green infrastructure, we are mostly talking about green walls, green roofs, and all of the other sort of the aspects of green infrastructure. What we are trying to do is bring the biodiversity and connectivity aspect as part of that larger landscape that values green infrastructure, and create something that is conducive to both humans and animals. So these are all our partners, and that's about it for me.
That's great timing. So I'll do as I did earlier with the roving microphone, take questions. So thank you very much for your presentation.
Thanks.
So who has the first question? See Justin at the back, so we'll get started with Justin, and then we'll take the question right next to you here.
I turned the mic off. Yeah.
Now it's back on. There we go.
Thanks.
More of a comment, but it was really nice to hear about reptiles, because and especially in the relationship to roads, it's a different scale, well, two different scales than we've been talking about. And you know, I played Frogger when I was a kid. I don't know how many, but that's like the ultimate connectivity challenge, right? For a reptile, you're trying to cross the road and there's all these cars that are going to run you over. And that's it's just I really appreciate that, to being able to think about it as a whole city and in terms of the way the roads break up the connectivity. So, just thank you.
Thank you.
Do you want to answer that one, or should we do two
Was
questions
there a question
at once? Yes, there wasn't so much a question. All right, we'll go here.
Hi, I wanted to thank you so much for the work you're doing. It's fabulous, the progress you've made just in the last 5 years. I was really interested in, especially for smaller creatures like salamanders and frogs, how you would get them to sort of go under the smaller passes right at that specifically small place. How would you sort of direct them to find those tunnels, or whether you're using factory cues, or whether that just seems where they normally cross and then that's enough. Particularly for things like frogs that don't normally like go under logs the way salamanders do. Yeah, it's just fascinating. Thank you.
We just put a signs for frogs. That no, so that's a good question. I just wanted to show a picture. I don't know. Oops. I don't have that. Anyhow, so that's a very good question. And when in all of the organisms, so all of these connectivity, the underpasses, overpasses, all of this has other design considerations. So I kind of mentioned other considerations fleetingly in my presentation. So that includes those other consideration, which means it has to have various elements, such as amphibians, they don't go inside the CSPs, the corrugated steel pipe. They don't like the coolness within it. There's light elements and so on. So the crossing itself needs to be designed such that it's conducive to the dominant species that we are trying to pass. But also around the crossing, there needs to be the cues. So there is a fencing, there's a funneling effect that basically goes with culverts. So there's a lot of studies that are showing now that the crossings itself, no matter how well designed, are not used because the funneling effect is not there. So fencing is, some sort of fencing effect needs to be done. There are various ways to do it. There can be physical sort of funnel-like fencing, or there could be habitat features, that some of the habitat features that they don't like, we could use that to basically funnel them into what they basically are gravitate towards. So all of those design considerations basically needs to be considered if this was to make any difference.
Thank you.
For the camera.
Okay. I really enjoyed the visual that you put of the 3 colors, and that's how one tool you're using to sort of bridge the partnership between, I think, between government and academics, engineers. Are there any other tools in your toolbox that you use to facilitate these partnerships? Because I think that's a great job that TRCA does.
Mm-hmm.
So I wonder if you could give us some tips for those who are trying to bridge these different worlds.
Yeah, on the connectivity issue, or
on any of the issues that you've worked on, just any interesting
yes, we could connect on that at a sort of separately as well. There are multiple tools. Like every project that I worked on kind of ends up in a tool, basically, mainly because I like tools. That might be one of the reasons. But another thing is, what I've noticed is that the decision makers they can't vision how to implement certain theory or certain concepts that we try to communicate. So it has really been our goal to provide them with almost like foolproof mechanism to translate what we are talking about. So this is Stream Crossings Guideline, that tool. Now if you are talking about, let's say if we are talking about restoration prioritization, we have same kind of prioritization tool that we have built that I think you mentioned that you have talked to Ralph at TRCA. So Ralph and I worked on that tool as well. So we have multiple tools depending on what you need. GIS has done tremendous service to us in terms of developing some of these tools in our toolbox to make this happen.
All right, I'll take two. I'll take Eva and Nicole.
Hello. So I have a question in regards to, does TRCA do any studies in terms of like pedestrian paths or roadways within the ravines that pedestrians are using? Because I noticed, especially with colony development being intensified around green spaces, a lot of these green areas have really high pedestrian traffic, and there's a lot of stressors in terms of like the interaction with wildlife in those areas.
That's again a very. You wanted to say
I could answer that within a city perspective.
Okay, so let me get to that, and then you can probably follow up on that. So good question again, because that's the question I get from every municipal staff right after I present the crossings guideline. So there's another guideline on pedestrian, because pedestrian crossing is at a different scale and it's in a different kind of setting than roads. So though the basic principles remain the same, it has to be dealt with slightly differently. It becomes on the road, under the road, under the trails, on the trails, and at the headways, and so on and so forth, trailheads and so on. So there's another piece of work that we are working on, and currently I'm on mat leave, so I don't know what's going on. But that was something that was going to be the next phase, is that trail guideline that is going to deal with some of those issues, including not just the crossing design, but some of the communication aspects and so on and so forth.
Yeah, so the City of Toronto is now working on, the transit division is working on a connectivity study and how to improve sidewalks and connectivity in the City of Toronto. So that might be also a good place to see if they're even looking at the element of wildlife. And just thought about it right now, they're working on it.
Thanks.
Hello? Yeah, it's working. Yeah, I did a road mortality study myself once, and it was on a very, very, very small scale, and I identified hotspots, and it kind of occurred to me how like site-specific they are for that moment when you're doing the study.
Yeah.
And I was just thinking about like climate change and like all the anticipated changes in the landscape and in like maybe the species composition that might be happening in the future. And I've heard whispers of things like temporary, like designs of temporary crossings that can be used or moved around. And I was just wondering if you or any of your partners have kind of come across anything like that, because those mega infrastructure projects are enormously expensive.
Yeah.
For crossing.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. The climate change issue, and that's so there are two aspects here. The road mortality studies, they usually, like I differentiated between the local connectivity and regional connectivity when I was talking about connectivity earlier. So local connectivity, again, like I said, there might be one wetland, one forest, like one patch of habitat that is still so important from like the, say for example, Heart Lake Road. It's amidst this suburban, very high density suburban area, but it's important for the residents there to do something about it. So road mortality studies usually get at that aspect of things. So what is currently there and how can we keep it there, kind of. So that is important, and road mortality studies makes a case for it, provides justification, and the initiatives are taken. I have not heard much about the temporary mitigation, but I'm sure that's true. What I would like to emphasize on is that, because that is something that's immediate gratification kind of thing, so you basically want to take care of it, and you can as well. But like you said, due to climate change and various land use changes that is going to happen in the next few years, just that is not enough. So road mortality studies are good for local connectivity, but that is not enough. So that's why we need to rely on some of the modeling tools, predictive tools, to get at longer term thinking. So dispersal, like migration is more local, more immediate, and so on. The daily movement is more local and more immediate, but the dispersal movements, if one wetland gets, due to climate change, gets dry, what are these species going to do? So they need to find another metapopulation to survive. And to do that, it's not a frequent movement. You can't measure it. I can't send my bios and do field work on it because it takes decades to identify that. But then we can predict some of that, and some of that is extremely hard to validate. But then that's where the circuit theory model basically tries to get at some of that predictions and tries to tackle those areas as well. And just a note to anyone from ecology here is that to validate this kind of long-term adaptation from connectivity perspective, the only way to validate is doing some genetic study, and that is another aspect that we are moving forward on. And I mentioned to Sue that we are working on NSERC funding to do some of those genetic studies, that whether over time, like 50, 100 years, are these frog populations actually, where there's better connectivity, are they actually thriving better than the others, and so on. So that's it's a different set of approach is needed than road mortality studies in that.
Next question. Okay, I'll go over here and then we'll return to you, Sue.
It's amazing. I really love the work. I'd like to talk more about developing tools in other cities that look like this afterwards. But I guess I have a couple methodological questions. I was curious about how, you mentioned that you're looking for a 300-meter distance for connectivity. I'm kind of interested in the methods you might have taken to sort of determine that distance, how you go about measuring movements of these animals, since I mean, it seems that as we get into looking at urban ecosystems and ecosystem services, that coming up with data for biological movement and behavior seems to be one of the biggest gaps in research. And so if there are any sort of, whatever your techniques were, I'd be interested to hear in how that happened. And then I'm also curious if there's a sense of understanding how biodiverse the region already is, and if you're shooting for increasing that, if there's a sort of future goal. I mean, because I understand we want to minimize tragic interactions on the roadway, right? But is there a sense of trying to increase biodiversity in general, and is there sort of like a future goal specifically that you're trying to achieve? And what tools do you use to model that future, I guess, is the other question.
That's a loaded question. There are 3 loaded questions.
3 loaded, too many questions.
Anyhow, so the first question, the answer to the first question in terms of methodology is that you're right, that there's a lot of sort of conflicting evidence and a lot of wide range of movement parameters for all different species. I basically broad brushed into wetland wildlife group, and here are the amphibians and reptiles. So that's how we went with in this. What we used was extensive literature search in terms of what organisms. TRCA does a lot, has a massive field program, so we know what kind of amphibians and reptiles we have in our jurisdiction. So we did extensive literature search, our own sort of the anecdotal biologists experience, as well as extensive literature reviews, as well as some of the GIS analysis, statistical analysis of the data that we currently had. We did all of that, and all in all, for amphibians and reptiles, even that is a very broad group. It is not applicable, 300 meters is not applicable for turtles. They can travel from 1 kilometer to 5-6 kilometers. Here it's more smaller spring peepers, wood frogs, and so on. Through all of these analysis, like multiple redundant analysis, we had, it was 300, 400, 500 meter range, and we settled on 300 because our statistical analysis also kind of leaned towards 300. So it was sort of a judgment call as well, but it is rooted in the average migration distance of this. So for dispersal, for that long term, it's going to be broader. Now we can settle at 1 kilometer because a lot of studies have said 1 kilometer is the maximum distance any amphibian can move, but again, we don't know. So that's why we didn't put any distance criteria in that. So there's a lot of generalization that has been made, and a lot of literature search was what was used for that, and statistical analysis. And that's, so for the, does that answer your question?
Yeah.
So For the second question, in terms of the goals, in terms of what kind of biodiversity are we setting the limit, setting our goal for, that is the question that I've asked in 3 workshops that I've organized so far on road ecology for our municipal partners. The official answer is we want all species to be preserved and actually enhanced for. But again, when it comes to actual work through the workshop and decide on what kind of money do we spend, it ends up being some of the key species, like sensitive species. It comes down to legislation, basically, that which are the ones that are endangered, which ones are Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry not allow us to extirpate or, you know, endangered and threatened. So there's a conflicting sort of value-based answer to that, which I don't know what the answer is exactly. TRCA, we have basically sort of broadly outlined that here are all our species, and this seems to be the general requirement of these species. We at the least don't want to lose them. So sort of that is where TRCA's, the Terrestrial Natural Heritage System strategy was based on that kind of assessment or assumption, let's say, that. And third question was...
I think 2 and 3 were sort of wrapped into one.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Yeah, I'm just wondering about plant corridors. Is there ever a need for those? I mean, some are obviously traversed by themselves or with the help of another animal or something, but I can see the case maybe with vegetatively propagating plants, or some that the pollen only just goes a short distance or things like that. But I don't know, maybe they would be locked out in ways that aren't usually considered by ecologists.
Yeah, no, we did actually think about that. We were thinking about insects and plants when we were going through this process. And the general consensus was that plants basically, if the agents of these pollinators, if wildlife basically can move around, then they basically move the seed. And that should generally take care of the plant movement, because plants themselves, the established plants themselves don't move. So it was more, we haven't thought, I must say that we haven't thought much in detail about this, but the general consensus when we started this was that if the agents of these seed propagation can move around, then plants should be okay. That was sort of how we proceeded with this.
Any other questions?
Do you, does TRCA integrate indigenous knowledge in looking at the way animals and various species travel or migrate or use these corridors, and also in figuring out what the landscape may have been, you know, prior to mapping, your mapping here?
So for this process, we did not. For the final review, we did send it out for review to various stakeholders, including some of the indigenous groups. We did not hear back from many of them. But TRCA in general, for most of the land planning and for restoration planning, and because this is more focused, like very limited scoped work, so this is sort of a little different story. But for that broader implementation side, yes, we do have a group that separately that deals with all of that communication and consultation phase, including all parties involved.
I have a question in terms of your work working with municipalities and with government officials, and it has to do with sustainability becoming like a dominant concept and becoming almost like a buzzword. It's being incorporated into the official plan. And based on your experience, have you seen that there is more emphasis now on, for example, incorporating these pilot projects in different municipalities? As well as I have a secondary question in terms of how far do you think we are in incorporating these initiatives as, for example, legislated or regulated rather than voluntary?
So for the first question, basically municipalities, depending on which group you speak to within each municipality, and also depending on where the municipality is located. For example, some of the rural municipalities versus like Toronto, say Toronto, now the perceptions differ, and also depending on which group that we are talking to, engineers versus planners versus ecologists, that also differs. But all in all, I must say that there has been a big shift. I can't speak for, decades of change, but over past decade at least, there has been a lot of openness towards incorporating the biodiversity needs and so on into a lot of the planning process. And largely, I think it has to do a lot with the terrestrial natural heritage system strategy, which was sort of almost like the push for municipalities to develop their own goals and agendas and so on. And obviously there are practical constraints that's still limited, but it's opening up more and more. And ecology side of things are more open than the more infrastructure-based, like engineering side and so on. So it's getting there, I should say. And sorry, I forgot this.
The second question was, how far do you, and I know you probably can't give us like a timeline, but do you think we're moving in the direction of making these changes, like these pilot projects, into like a requirement rather than continue as like voluntary and incentive basis?
So a requirement, some of these are requirements as well, like for example, within valley corridors, within ravines, some of them are mandated by legislation, so it's there. But if you're talking about broader landscape, broader road ecology issues, infrastructure, it has to be voluntary to some extent, but moving towards sort of the one way that we can see this happening is going through the planning process. There is a whole planning process that goes towards approving a road or approving development and so on. So if it's built into that process, then it could be, I wouldn't say a requirement, but sort of a procedural check mark, let's say. So and I think it is getting there. It might get there because already now a lot of municipalities where engineers and ecologists weren't even communicating before, they are doing that now because they know that this issue is going to come up during the review process.
Any final questions? We have time for one or two more questions if there are any more. Okay.
This is a really quick question, so maybe you have time for 3.
What is a Natura 2000 forest? I saw it on your map.
Oh, that is European version of a terrestrial natural heritage system. So there was early 2000, there was this whole sweep of scientific community doing these green space planning basically. And we were doing terrestrial natural heritage system, US was doing their own version, and Europe was doing across countries their own green space planning, and Natura 2000 was their consolidated version of green space network. That slide was borrowed from a European colleague of mine, so.